Out on the dry red ground near Savo, they found a baby elephant standing alone, his trunk crushed by a steel snare and already beginning to die. Everyone understood what that meant. For a calf that young, losing the use of his trunk was almost the same as losing his chance to live. Then came the sleepless nights, the rejected feedings, the worsening numbers, and the moment even the rescue team feared they had arrived too late. But just when hope was nearly gone, a secret at the water trough and a piece of night footage no one was prepared for revealed something unbelievable. This little elephant was no longer waiting to be saved. He had already begun teaching himself how to survive. And that changed the way everyone saw him, and the future they thought had already been decided. The morning they found him began without drama. Heat was already lifting off the red earth outside Savo, turning the low brush silver at the edges, while dust moved in thin ribbons over the game trail. Nothing in the landscape looked urgent. Even the birds sounded ordinary. Then Ranger Evan Cole spotted a shape standing too still in the scrub and told the driver to stop. From a distance, the calf almost disappeared into the color of the land. He was small enough to be mistaken for a mound of shadow between the acacia trunks, but something about the posture felt wrong. He was not grazing, not wandering, not calling for his mother. He was simply there, facing the open plain, as if whatever had happened to him had already taken him somewhere else. When Evan stepped closer, he saw how young the elephant really was. The calf could not have been more than a few weeks old, with oversized ears, a rounded forehead, and legs that still looked slightly too thin for his body. There should have been a herd nearby, a mother crashing through brush, a low rumble in the air. Instead, there was only silence, and the silence felt unnatural. Then Evan saw the wire. A rusted steel snare had tightened around the lower part of the calf's trunk, biting deep enough to bury itself in swollen flesh. The tissue below it had turned dark and angry, almost black at the edges, and the trunk hung strangely still. A healthy calf would have been reaching, twitching, investigating the world. This one barely seemed to feel the flies landing on him. The calf did not cry out when Evan approached. That frightened him more than panic would have. Animals that still believed they could fight usually kicked, stumbled, or bolted. This calf only shifted once, a weak adjustment of weight, then froze again. His eyes were open, but they did not settle on any one thing. He looked like he had been standing there a long time, waiting for something that never came back. Evan radioed the rescue center with a voice steadier than he felt. He gave coordinates, described the injury, then added words he did not usually say out loud. He's still alive, but not for long. While they waited, Noah Kibet, the older, tracker riding with the patrol, crouched a few yards away and studied the sand. There were no fresh adult prints nearby. Whatever herd the calf belonged to was long gone. The sun climbed fast. Heat pressed downward. A single bead of moisture slipped from the calf's mouth, and he made a faint motion with his damaged trunk, more memory than function. Noah muttered that a calf this young should have been tucked under his mother's chest, hidden in shade, touched every few seconds by another body. Out here, alone in the open, he looked less like a wild animal than a child left behind by the world. The rescue truck arrived in a storm of dust nearly 40 minutes later. Dr. Rachel Mercer stepped out before the engine had fully died, medical bag already in hand. She took in the scene in one glance: the calf, the wire, the deadened trunk, the empty horizon. Evan expected encouragement, some clean sentence to make the moment feel manageable. Instead, Rachel said quietly, "If that trunk is gone, everything goes with it." She approached the calf slowly, not soft exactly, but careful in the way of someone who respected pain. The little elephant flinched only when her shadow crossed his face. Up close, the damage was worse than it had looked from 10 feet away. The wire had sunk so deep that flesh had swollen around it like bark around a nail. Rachel touched the upper trunk gently, then lower down, and felt almost no response at all. Mia Turner, the youngest tech on the rescue team, knelt beside the kit and handed Rachel the cutters with shaking fingers. Daniel Brooks moved to the calf's shoulder to steady him if he collapsed. For one suspended second, nobody spoke. Then Rachel slid the tool into place and cut the snare apart. The metal snapped open with a dry sound, and the trunk dropped lower, limp and heavy, as if even freedom had come too late. What followed was movement without relief. Rachel flushed the wound in the field, while Mia recorded pulse, respiration, and temperature. Daniel and Evan rigged a canvas sling under the calf's belly. Noah stood at the truck bed and counted every step as they lifted. The calf was lighter than he should have been, yet still heavy enough to remind them he was fighting gravity, shock, heat, pain, and abandonment all at once. Once inside the truck, the calf swayed, then leaned weakly into the corner as Rachel climbed in beside him. She kept one hand against his neck through the first miles, feeling the small tremors that moved through him whenever the tires hit ruts. Outside, Tsavo rolled past in strips of thorn and dust. Inside, no one talked much. Every eye kept returning to the trunk, hanging silent where his future was supposed to be. About 20 minutes into the drive, the calf made a tiny effort that Rachel would remember later. He lifted the upper part of his trunk a fraction, not enough to reach her, not enough to do anything useful, just enough to show that somewhere inside the haze of shock, some instinct was still searching. Rachel did not call it hope, not yet. But she shifted closer, and for the first time, the calf did not pull away. By the time the truck rolled through the rescue center gates, the sun had gone hard and white above the paddocks. Heat shimmered over the fencing, and the low buildings seemed to float in it. The calf lifted his head once at the change in sound, then let it sink again. He had survived the road, but survival still felt like a temporary condition. They carried him into the medical bay, built for orphans too young to understand what had happened to them. The room smelled of disinfectant, warm formula, damp hay, and cut fruit from the feed room next door. He did not react to any of it. His eyes stayed open, fixed on some middle distance beyond the walls, as if his body had arrived before the rest of him. Rachel worked without urgency in her voice, which was how everyone knew the case was bad. Mia clipped a monitor to the calf's ear while Daniel steadied his shoulder and Noah stood near the door, hat in hand, watching with the stillness of a man who had already seen enough hard endings to recognize one forming. The calf swayed once, then went quiet again. When Rachel cleaned the wound properly, the truth came into focus. The tissue around the lower trunk was deeply compressed, the nerves likely damaged far beyond the surface injury. Above the snare line, there was weak response. Below it, almost nothing. She tested sensation twice, hoping the second answer might contradict the first. It did not. The trunk hung there like something disconnected. For a young elephant, the trunk was not just a feature. It was how the world made contact. It reached for milk, for touch, for reassurance in the dark. It learned the shape of safety through movement. This calf could not use it that way anymore. Rachel said the words out loud because someone had to. If he can't feed properly, he won't make it through the week. Mia looked down at her chart instead of at the animal. Daniel exhaled through his nose and turned to begin setting up the feeding supplies. Noah took one slow step closer to the calf, studying the small face, the oversized ears, the dry skin folded at the neck. He should still be sleeping against his mother, he said. No one answered because there was nothing useful to add. They mixed the first formula in near silence, warming it to the right temperature, testing the flow through a long rubber nipple designed for calves too weak to latch. Rachel knelt beside him and touched the corner of his mouth. For a second, he gave the faintest sign of interest, a reflex more than a decision. Then he turned away. The bottle followed, and he refused it again. The second attempt took 20 minutes. Rachel guided the nipple farther back, while Daniel supported the head, and Mia kept one hand against the calf's chest, counting breaths. At last, he swallowed a little. Then a little more. Not enough to comfort anyone, but enough to keep the room moving. Rachel did not smile. She only said, "Again in 2 hours," and wrote the number down. So the first day settled into a rhythm no one could afford, and no one questioned. Formula, medication, wound irrigation, temperature checks, notes, then start over. The calf accepted some feedings and rejected others, and every small success vanished into the fear of the next attempt. By evening, Mia had stopped asking how he was doing, and started asking only what came next. Outside the bay, the rescue center followed its ordinary patterns. Trucks came and went. Caretakers moved sugarcane across the yard. Birds gathered at the water tank and burst up in nervous flocks whenever a gate slammed shut. Inside, time narrowed around the calf's body. Each hour seemed to ask the same question in a slightly different voice. Could he be kept alive until morning? Near dusk, Rachel reviewed his numbers at the counter while the light turned amber. Through the wire mesh: weight low, hydration poor, shock not resolved, neurological response minimal. Mia stood beside her, exhausted already, and waited for something encouraging to appear on the page. Rachel closed the file instead. "We do not need a good week," she said. "We need one good night." That night, Daniel took the midnight feeding, and Noah stayed longer than anyone asked him to. The calf had been moved into a padded enclosure inside the medical wing, small enough to keep him safe, quiet enough that he could hear human footsteps coming before the door opened. When Daniel entered with the bottle, he found the calf standing in the corner, facing the wall as if he had chosen the farthest place from everyone. He tried the bottle 3 times. On the third attempt, the calf took only a few swallows before turning his head sharply aside. His body was beginning to show the strain of losing what it needed most. There was no outburst, no dramatic collapse, just a kind of steady retreat. Daniel sat down on an overturned feed bucket after the failed feeding and stayed there for nearly an hour without speaking. Around 2 in the morning, Rachel returned in clean scrubs with her hair tied back and sleep nowhere on her face. She checked the wound, adjusted the fluids, and stood very still beside the enclosure. Mia, pale with fatigue, asked the question no one wanted to ask. Rachel did not soften it. "Keep him alive through the night," she said. After that, We'll see what he gives us." The calf heard the voices, the footsteps, the opening latch, the bottle touching the floor. He did not understand the words, but he seemed to understand the pattern. Every time the door opened, they came back. Every time pain woke him, there was another body nearby. Near dawn, he shifted his weight, lifted the upper part of his damaged trunk a fraction into the cool air, and stood listening while the sky outside slowly changed color. By the third morning, the rescue center had begun to organize itself around the calf's weakness. The feed room clock seemed louder than usual, each hour landing with the weight of an obligation no one could postpone. Outside, the air over Tsavo shimmered with heat again, but inside the medical wing, the light stayed pale and filtered, as if the building itself were trying not to disturb him. He was still standing more often than he should have been. Young calves usually folded down into sleep when exhaustion overtook them, trusting the world enough to rest completely. This one fought sleep in short, stubborn intervals, legs trembling, head lowered, ears hanging still. When he finally did lie down, it was only for minutes at a time before some discomfort or memory seemed to pull him back up. Rachel noticed first that the problem was no longer only feeding. The calf was withdrawing from contact itself. When Mia entered with fresh formula, he turned his body away before she even reached him. When Daniel sat near the enclosure, the calf drifted to the far corner and stood facing the wall. It was not fear exactly. It felt more like a quiet refusal to spend energy on anything that was not absolutely necessary. The numbers confirmed what the room already knew. His weight had dropped again. His hydration was barely holding. The wound looked cleaner, and the swelling above the snare line had eased a little. But below the injury, the trunk remained largely absent from him, hanging slack and foreign. Rachel touched the lower section with gauze, then with the back of her fingers. He gave almost nothing back. Mia had started writing down every swallow, every refusal, every sign of movement in a notebook she kept tucked beneath the feeding tray. By noon on day 3, her notes had become a list of diminishing returns. She tried not to let her face show it, but Daniel could see the fear settling in. He had worked around hurt animals long enough to know that sometimes the first thing to go was not the body. It was the will to engage. That afternoon, Noah returned from checking the outer fencing and stood at the enclosure without speaking. The calf was motionless, except for a small, repetitive sway, weight shifting from one front foot to the other. Noah had seen older elephants do that after losing members of a herd. The movement was not dramatic, just rhythmic and private, as if the body were trying to soothe a pain too large to understand. Rachel hated assigning human meanings to animal behavior, but even she could not ignore what the calf was showing them. He was not just injured. He was alone in a way his species was never meant to be. At barely a few weeks old, he had already lost the constant pressure of a mother's body, the low rumble of a herd nearby, the touch that tells a calf the world is still intact. They tried a different bottle that evening, then a different angle, then a slower flow. The calf accepted a little formula, then clamped down and turned his head so, abruptly, the nipple slipped free. Milk spilled onto the bedding. Mia cleaned it up without a word. Daniel reset the blanket under the calf's chest. Rachel wrote new instructions for the night shift and crossed them out almost immediately, because none of it changed the central truth. By 9 o'clock, The rescue center had gone mostly quiet. The other staff had finished the last of the routine work, and the generator hummed under the dark like a second heartbeat. In the medical wing, Daniel took the first night watch, while Mia sat on an empty sack of feed outside the door, trying to summon enough strength for the next round. She had not meant to cry, but the tears came anyway, sudden and angry. Rachel found her there with both hands over her face. For a second, she said nothing. Then she sat beside her on the concrete step, shoulders almost touching. Mia asked whether they were helping him or only making him stay alive longer for more pain. Rachel looked out toward the dark paddocks before answering. "If he's still trying, we keep going," she said. "When he stops, we'll know." Inside, the calf had backed himself once again into the same corner. He stood with his face turned toward the wall, trunk hanging uselessly, one rear foot resting lightly, as if even standing on all four legs had become too much. Daniel entered with the bottle and waited before approaching. Sometimes rushing an animal only deepened the retreat. Tonight, the calf did not turn. He seemed to be listening to something farther away. The first feeding failed. The second was worse. He would not open properly, would not swallow more than a trace, and once or twice he made a small, frustrated sound deep in his throat that seemed to surprise even him. Rachel came in for the third attempt around midnight, hair damp from a quick wash, medical file tucked beneath one arm. She tried the bottle herself and got almost nothing for her trouble. When she checked him over again, she saw that the skin around his eyes had changed, not swollen, not infected, just dulled somehow, as if the last of his alertness were dimming behind the pain. She stepped back and wrote a new line in the chart. Survival unlikely. The words looked harsher on paper than they had in her mind, but she left them there. She had built a career on telling the truth, before comfort. Near 1 a.m, after the equipment had been cleaned and the latest failed feeding recorded, Rachel did something that was not in any protocol. She dragged an overturned bucket into the enclosure and sat down several feet from the calf, far enough not to pressure him, close enough that he could sense her breathing. She did not reach for him. She did not speak. She only remained where he could feel he was no longer alone. For a long time, nothing changed. The calf stayed turned away, swaying faintly, ears still. Then, little by little, the movement slowed. His breathing settled into a deeper rhythm. He did not come closer, but he no longer pressed himself so hard into the corner either. Rachel sat there until her legs went numb, and the first gray hint of dawn began to gather beyond the mesh window, and in that thin quiet, she understood how fragile the next day would be. Morning entered the rescue center slowly on the 6th day, not with relief, but with a kind of cautious light that seemed afraid to touch too much. The calf was still alive. That alone had begun to feel improbable. He stood in the same enclosure, thinner now, with the outline of his bones more visible beneath the skin, as if the body were quietly subtracting itself piece by piece. He accepted only part of the dawn feeding. Rachel marked the amount in the file and said nothing. Mia rinsed the bottle at the sink and kept her eyes lowered, already bracing for another hard day. Daniel changed the bedding, while Noah unlatched the outer gate to the small yard attached to the medical wing. The calf watched them all with a tired, distant focus, then turned his head toward the light. The outside pen had been added on day 4 to give him air and supervised movement when the weather allowed. It was not large, only a fenced patch of dry ground with a little shade, a low rail, and beyond that, the northern water station used by older animals when the rest of the center was busier. In theory, none of that mattered to a calf whose hydration was being managed by hand. Still, Noah had a habit of looking where other people did not. That morning, as he crossed the yard to check a loose latch, he slowed near the water station and studied the ground. The soil there was finer than in the enclosure, packed light by repeated use, and it held marks well after the night cooled. He stood without moving for several seconds, then called Daniel over with only a tilt of the head. At first, the signs looked like nothing. A small patch of scraped dirt, a dark splash mark dried against the trough's concrete lip. 2 shallow depressions side by side in the earth, not hoofprints, not boot tracks either. Daniel frowned and crouched beside Noah, tracing the edge of one mark with a finger. It was broad, rounded, and too deliberate to have been made by accident. Mia joined them next, wiping her hands on a towel, and Rachel came last, chart still under one arm. The calf remained under the shade behind them, swaying faintly. Noah pointed to the ground, then to the trough. "These weren't here yesterday," he said. Rachel glanced once at the waterline, once at the disturbed dirt, then back at the calf. Something about the spacing bothered her immediately. No one had brought him out there overnight. Daniel was certain of that. The night log showed 3 failed feedings, 1 partial, 1 wound cleaning, and Rachel's hour inside the enclosure before dawn. The outer gate had remained latched. At least, that was what the record said. Mia looked unsettled enough to recheck it twice. Every note matched. On paper, the trough should have been irrelevant. Rachel stepped closer to the concrete edge. There was a faint scuff where something had pressed and slipped. Another on the side wall. She imagined the calf somehow wandering there in darkness, but the image refused to settle. He was weak, dehydrated, and barely taking enough formula to stand. The idea that he had crossed the yard during the night felt unlikely. The marks said otherwise. The possibility no one wanted was human error. A gate left unsecured. A late shift shortcut forgotten in the log. Or worse, another animal entering the yard after dark. Noah shook his head before anyone said it aloud. There were no other tracks. No adult elephant prints, no jackal, no hyena, not even bird scratches close enough to explain the splash. Whatever had happened at that trough had involved only one body. Back inside, the calf stood with his head low and eyes half-lidded. But there was a new detail Rachel could not ignore. Mud had dried in a faint line along one front knee, as if he had knelt somewhere damp enough to stain him. Daniel saw it too, and went very still. Mia whispered, almost to herself, "He couldn't have." No one answered, because certainty had already begun slipping out of the room. Rachel moved around the enclosure, checking the latch, the threshold, the boards, every place where the known routine might have failed. At the lower hinge of the outer section, she found a tiny gap. Nothing broken, just enough looseness that a persistent animal might have nudged through if the interior panel had not been set flush. It was a small flaw, the kind no one notices until something passes through it. By late morning, the question had changed shape. It was no longer whether a mistake had been made. It was what the calf had done once he got outside. Noah stood near the trough again, replaying the spacing of those marks in his mind. Daniel measured the distance from the yard gate to the water station and said it aloud under his breath, as if numbers. could calm what instinct was already telling him. Rachel ordered the camera footage from the night security system before lunch. The cameras had been installed more for paperwork than for rescue work, and most days they recorded nothing worth discussing. Empty pens, moving shadows, moths hitting the lens. Mia went to the administration room to pull the files, while Rachel returned to the enclosure and watched the calf in silence. He did not look extraordinary. He looked exhausted. That was what unsettled her most. If there had been some dramatic burst of strength, some visible turning point in his condition, the mystery would have felt easier to hold. But he was still the same injured little elephant, thin and failing and strangely quiet, with a trunk that could not do the one thing his life depended on. And yet the ground outside suggested that sometime in the darkness he had tried something. The afternoon lengthened around that thought. Feedings continued. Notes were written. The wound was cleaned again. The calf refused one bottle, took a little from the next, then drifted back toward his corner. But now every ordinary motion inside the medical wing carried a second current beneath it, a silent pull toward the room where the footage was loading. Something had happened while no one was watching. As evening came on, Rachel stood by the enclosure one more time before heading to the administration building. The calf lifted his head a fraction, not enough to ask for anything, only enough to register that she was there. Beyond the open yard, the trough sat quiet under the fading sky, plain and still and impossible. Whatever secret it held was waiting on a hard drive in another room, already recorded, already real. The administration room was always colder than the rest of the center, as if paperwork required a different climate from suffering. By the time Rachel entered, Mia had already pulled up the footage from camera 3 on an old monitor with a dim blue cast. Daniel stood behind her with both hands on the back of a chair. Noah stayed near the door. No one spoke. Even before they saw anything, the room felt braced. At first, the screen showed exactly what they expected from most nights at the rescue center. Empty fencing, pale gravel, the long stillness of a place between routines. A moth crossed the frame, then another. The timestamp in the corner crawled forward, minute by minute. Mia almost wondered if they had made too much of a few strange marks in the dirt. Then, at 3:11 a.m., a small shape entered from the left. It was the calf. Even in grainy black and white, there was no mistaking the proportions. The rounded head, the oversized ears, the slight unsteadiness in the legs. He moved more slowly than anyone in the room had imagined, stopping twice as he crossed the yard, as if the ground itself required thought. His trunk hung low and still beneath him. The image on the screen did not look like strength. It looked like necessity. Noah took one step closer. Daniel leaned so far forward, the chair beneath his hands creaked. The calf reached the water station and stood there, facing the trough in profile. For several long seconds, nothing happened. He did not drink. He did not turn back. He only remained at the edge, motionless except for a small shift in balance, as though he had come to the limit of what instinct alone could teach him. Then he tried the obvious thing first. He lowered the trunk toward the water, but the damaged lower section failed him immediately, slipping aside without curl or grip, barely disturbing the surface. He lifted it again, paused, and tried once more. The result was the same. Mia pressed a hand to her mouth. On the monitor, the calf did not panic. He only stood still, absorbing failure in the dark, What happened next unfolded so slowly that it took a second viewing for any of them to trust their own eyes. The calf widened his stance. He shifted his weight forward. Then, with a care that seemed almost deliberate beyond his age, he bent his front legs and lowered himself down, not collapsing, not stumbling, kneeling. His chest stayed lifted, while his knees settled into the dirt exactly where Noah had found the marks. Daniel whispered something under his breath that no one caught. The calf stretched his neck, brought his face lower, and tested the edge of the trough with the side of his mouth. Water rippled. He adjusted again, pressing his chin lightly against the concrete for leverage. Then he dipped farther and drank directly with his mouth, not through the trunk at all, but the only way left to him. The room stayed silent as the footage went on. He remained in that awkward posture for nearly a minute, lifted his head, swallowed, then lowered himself again. There was nothing graceful about it. It was work. His body looked too small for the problem he was solving. But he kept going, repeating the motion with patient concentration, inventing a method no one had shown. Him, out there alone under a camera, no one expected to matter. When the clip ended, no one moved to stop the playback. Mia rewound it with trembling fingers and started it again from the moment he entered the frame. This time, they watched the details more carefully. The hesitation at the trough, the failed attempt with the trunk, the pause, the shift, the kneeling. Rachel felt something inside her professional judgment begin to rearrange itself, not emotionally at first, but structurally. The case she had been holding in her mind was built on injury, prognosis, feeding tolerance, nerve response, and the hard limits of what a trunk meant to a calf this young. It had never included this, not because she lacked imagination, but because medicine taught patterns, and this little elephant had just stepped outside the nearest pattern available. He had met a biological dead end and treated it like a problem instead. Daniel was the first to speak. He did not take his eyes off the screen when he said it. He doesn't want to die. The sentence was plain and almost rough in his voice, but it altered the air in the room. Noah folded his arms and looked down once, as if the truth of it had landed somewhere deeper than surprise. Mia blinked hard and rewound the clip again, unwilling to lose the evidence by accident. Rachel watched the kneeling a third time. The scientific part of her mind kept sorting what mattered. No modeling behavior from older elephants, no human training, no reinforcement. The calf had observed the trough, tested a failed strategy, adjusted his body, and generated another. Whether anyone called that intelligence, adaptation, instinct, or desperation hardly mattered. The outcome on the screen was the same. He had taught himself to drink. By the time they left the administration room, evening had lowered over the center. The northern yard looked ordinary again, almost insultingly so. The trough sat where it always had, quiet and practical, as if it had not just become the center of a mystery solved by a dying calf. Daniel walked ahead without speaking. Noah peeled off toward the fencing. Mia carried the copied footage like it might somehow break if held too loosely. Rachel went straight to the enclosure. The calf was standing near the gate this time rather than in his usual corner, his head turned slightly toward the sound of her steps. He still looked fragile. The wound still existed. The trunk was still damaged. Nothing visible about him had changed in the last hour. And yet everything had changed, because now she knew there was a second story running beneath the clinical one. She stepped inside and stopped a few feet away. The calf did not retreat. His eyes rested on her with that same distant, dark steadiness he had worn since the field. But there was something else in the stillness now, something less like surrender and more like effort held in reserve. Rachel did not kneel or touch him. She only stood there, letting the new fact settle between them. He was not waiting to be saved. He was already trying to save himself. The next morning, the center changed its habits without anyone formally announcing that it had. The calf was still the same injured animal he had been the night before, but now every person around him carried a new awareness into the room. They no longer saw only what was failing. They had seen what he did in the dark when no one was helping, and that changed the shape of every decision. Rachel walked the yard before sunrise with Noah and Daniel, studying the path from the enclosure to the trough as if it were evidence from another kind of case. The distance was not great, but for a calf, this week, it should have felt impossible. Noah pointed out where the soil dipped slightly near the rail, giving him easier footing. Daniel measured the trough's height against the calf's shoulder and said, "We make this easier on him." By noon, the first adjustments were in place. The sharp edge of the concrete was padded with strips of old rubber hose split open and wired flat. A layer of softer soil was spread where his knees had landed. Daniel lowered the water level by a few inches so the reach would be shorter. They were simple changes, practical and unglamorous, but everyone understood what they meant. The center was no longer asking him to adapt alone. When they opened the yard that afternoon, the calf hesitated in the doorway, then stepped into the light. He looked smaller outside, almost swallowed by the brightness and open space, but his attention was sharper than it had been in days. He turned his head toward the trough, stood still for a moment, then continued forward with that same careful, unsteady determination. Nobody called to him. Nobody tried to guide him. They only watched. At the water station, he paused in the same place the camera had captured. His damaged trunk drifted once across the concrete lip, then fell away. Rachel felt Mia stiffen beside her as though the memory of the footage had made this moment feel almost too intimate to witness. Then the calf widened his front stance, bent his knees, and lowered himself down. It was awkward, slow, and absolutely deliberate. This time, it worked more easily. He drank longer than he had on the recording. Not much in human terms, but enough that Noah exhaled and took off his hat without seeming to realize he had done it. Water ran down the calf's chin and darkened the padded edge. When he lifted his head again, the movement looked less like desperation and more like the beginning of a routine. Rachel made no note in that instant. She simply watched and let the significance arrive whole. The first weight increase came the following morning, so slight Mia checked the scale twice before writing it down. It was not enough to call a turnaround, but it interrupted the downward slide that had been haunting every chart since he arrived. Rachel said only, "Again tomorrow." Still, the room felt different after that. Even the failed feedings lost some of their finality. He was now taking in something the bottle had not been giving him. Over the next several days, the calf moved between two fragile systems of survival. Formula still came every 2 hours, some taken, some refused. The trough supplied what his own invention had made possible. Between those moments, he rested more fully than before. He began to lie down without springing back up so quickly. His breathing deepened. The The repetitive sway lessened. He was still weak, but the weakness no longer looked like a straight road. Mia noticed curiosity before anyone else named it. One afternoon, she found him standing near the rail, using the functional upper part of his trunk to tap at the chain on the gate. Not with skill exactly, but with focus. Another day, he watched Daniel wheel in fresh bedding and followed the cart with slow, intent eyes from one end of the pen to the other. He was no longer turning away from every part of the world. Daniel brought an old blue enrichment ball from storage near the feed room, faded by sun and half scuffed from years of use with other animals. The calf stared at it at first, as if it were some creature from another habitat. Then, after a long pause, he nudged it with his forehead. It rolled away. He followed, pushed it again, harder this time, and for a brief second, something almost playful flashed through him before disappearing back into caution. That evening, while the sky softened over the paddocks and the generator hummed low behind the buildings, Daniel sat on his folding chair just outside the enclosure gate. He had started doing that after the hardest nights, saying little, simply occupying space where the calf could see him. The little elephant moved closer than usual, not touching, only standing nearby with a heaviness that seemed less like collapse now and more like trust. Noah noticed that the calf had begun remembering paths. Even in dim light, he angled toward the trough without hesitation, stepping around the same rough patch of ground each time as though he had mapped it internally. "He knows where he's going," Noah said one night, more to himself than anyone else. Mia repeated the line later while updating the board in the clinic, and something about it stayed with the team. The name arrived quietly, the way names often do in places where people spend too much time together under strain. Mia wrote "Scout" in small letters on the corner of a scratch pad beside the feeding log, then tried to cross it out. Daniel saw it and said nothing. Noah, passing the board, gave the faintest nod. When Rachel heard Daniel use it under his breath in the yard 2 days later, she did not correct him. By the end of the week, the calf was still far from safe. His wound needed daily care. His lower trunk remained badly compromised. Any infection, any setback, any run of poor feedings could still undo what little they had gained. But the center no longer felt like a place waiting for him to die. The atmosphere had shifted into something quieter and more dangerous than hope. It was belief, and belief asked more of everyone. That night, after the last bottle round, Rachel stood in the dim enclosure while Scout rested on his sternum in the bedding, not fully asleep, not fully alert. His trunk lay beside him in its strange partial silence, but his ears flicked once at the sound of her step. Outside, the trough sat under moonlight, ordinary as ever. Rachel looked at the calf, then at the doorway leading to the yard, and understood that the story had changed. He was teaching them how to continue. 14 months changed the scale of everything except the memory of how close he had come to disappearing. Scout was no longer the frail calf who had fit inside a truck bed with room to spare. He had grown into himself in broad, uneven stages, legs stronger, shoulders higher, ears beginning to carry the outline of the adult. Elephant he might one day have become under different circumstances. The center had expanded his paddock twice. What began as a recovery enclosure was now a larger space with reinforced fencing, shade structures, a modified trough, and a rotation of enrichment objects Daniel insisted on changing before Scout could grow bored with them. Most mornings, Scout made a slow inspection of the perimeter, touching posts and rails with the upper part of his trunk, forehead, and lips, as if confirming the world was still arranged the way he remembered it. His injury had not disappeared with time. Rachel's neurological assessments were careful, repeated, and unsentimental. Some function had returned below the old snare line, enough for limited curl, for partial pressure, for a few clumsy exploratory movements, but not enough, not for stripping bark, not for drawing water in the normal way, not for the full, efficient feeding and self-sufficiency a wild elephant would need every day without fail. Scout compensated the way he had always compensated, by refusing to let a limitation finish the sentence for him. He used the lower part of his trunk when he could, his lips when that worked better, his forehead and body weight when subtlety failed. He pushed logs, shifted feed piles, manipulated hanging objects, and once to Daniel's lasting delight, managed to drag a loose canvas flap toward himself, using one knee and the side of his head like a patient engineer. Mia had long since replaced the panic of her early notes with a steadier kind of attention. Her logs tracked behavior as carefully as weight and appetite now. Route memory, object investigation, social response, frustration, tolerance. Noah added his own observations from the yard and outer fencing, often in shorter lines that somehow said more. Scout anticipates gate sounds. Scout chooses the shaded path in afternoon heat. Scout adjusts when the ground is uneven. Daniel, who had once sat through failed midnight, feedings with nothing to offer but presence, had become Scout's evening constant. When the day wound down and the center quieted, Scout often drifted toward the fence where Daniel placed his old folding chair. They still rarely touched. They did not need to. The calm between them had become one of the fixed elements of the place, as reliable as the generator hum or the smell of hay after sundown. Rachel kept the clinical truth in front of herself because sentiment could make professionals sloppy. Scout was adaptive, intelligent, and undeniably thriving compared to the animal they had rescued. He was also permanently impaired. Both things were true. The trouble with unusual cases, she knew, was that people often chose the truth they preferred and ignored the one that made decisions harder. She was determined not to become one of those people. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning in a stack of routine correspondence that had no right to contain anything capable of changing the atmosphere of a whole center. It came from the Wildlife Authority, addressed to the director, and copied to Rachel as Chief Veterinary Officer. By the time she reached the second paragraph, the office around her had gone strangely silent, as if even paper could alter the pressure in the air. The language was formal, measured, and devastatingly clean. Scout's case had been reviewed under established release criteria for orphaned elephants with long-term injuries. His recovery was acknowledged. His behavioral adaptation was noted. But the conclusion remained clear. Permanent trunk impairment significantly reduced his chances of surviving independently in the wild. A transfer had been approved to a managed sanctuary in another country, where his care could continue for life. There was nothing cruel in the letter. That was what made it harder to argue with. The sanctuary was reputable. The plan was legal. The reasoning was professionally sound in the abstract. Rachel read it twice, then set it on the desk and stared through the office window toward the northern paddock, where Scout was midway through his usual fence inspection. He looked settled there, self-possessed, almost ordinary in his own strange way. Mia knew something was wrong before Rachel called the team together. Daniel arrived with dust still on his boots. Noah came in last, closing the meeting room door with more force than usual. Rachel passed around copies and let the paper do its work. She watched each face change in a different rhythm. Mia reading too fast, then slowing. Daniel going expressionless. Noah finishing early and staring at the wall instead of the page. No one argued with the facts first. That would have been too easy, and none of them were careless enough for that. Scout could not drink normally. He could not process rough forage the way a wild elephant needed to. If the question was whether standard criteria placed him outside the safest release category, the answer was yes. Rachel said as much herself. Then she placed her hand on the table and added the part the letter could not fully contain. Standard criteria describe standard cases, she said. Scout has never been a standard case. She spoke without heat, which somehow made the room listen harder. She listed the evidence already in their files. The nighttime footage, the sustained compensatory behavior, the route memory, the feeding adaptations, the long-term stability of his routines, the measurable way he had built a life around an injury that should have ended him. None of it erased the risk, but it complicated the conclusion. Daniel was the first to answer. He did not speak emotionally. He never did. He only said that moving Scout now would break more than habit. The animal knew this place, its paths, its voices, its timing, its calm. Noah added that Scout did not just survive inside the paddock. He read it, adjusted to it, used it. Mia, still holding the letter, said what none of the official language could bring itself to say. They're deciding from his limits, not from what he actually does. Rachel had already made her choice before the meeting began, but saying it aloud gave it form. She would appeal, not with outrage, not with sentiment, and not by pretending the authorities' concern was foolish. She would build the strongest case she could from the thing institutions respected most: records, weight charts, behavioral logs, neurological assessments, video evidence. Everything Scout had demonstrated over 14 months would be organized into one argument no one could dismiss as affection. Outside, Scout knew none of this. He spent that afternoon investigating a newly dragged log near the shade line, approaching it from 3 sides as if every angle might reveal different information. When Daniel came out later, Scout left the log and moved toward the fence in the unhurried way he always did, carrying his partial trunk and his full attention into the late light. Rachel watched from the office window and felt the clean, hard edge of the fight ahead settle into place. The appeal did not change the center all at once. Work still had to be done in the same order, with the same discipline, as if paperwork had no power over feeding times, wound checks, or gate latches. But beneath the ordinary rhythm, everything carried an added tension now. Every observation mattered more. Every routine Scout completed without help felt less like habit and more like evidence. Rachel built the case at night after the yard had gone quiet. She spread files across her desk in careful stacks: medical reports, behavior logs, weight charts, gate notes, feed records, and still frames pulled from the old security footage. Mia helped organize the digital archive, labeling clips by date and behavior. Noah contributed field notes in his spare, exact style. Daniel wrote the longest statement of his life and crossed nothing out. What emerged was not an argument that Scout was uninjured. Rachel refused that kind of wishful thinking from the start. The appeal was built on something harder to dismiss, proof that this elephant had repeatedly generated workable solutions to limitations that should have narrowed his life beyond repair. Not once, not by accident, but consistently, over months, in ways that remained stable under stress, routine, and change. She included everything that could be measured. The reversal in his weight curve after he taught himself to drink, the modifications he learned to navigate without prompting, the repeated use of alternate feeding strategies, the pattern of object interaction that showed planning rather than random contact, the route memory, the calm social regulation around trusted keepers. Scout, the file said in 100 different ways, was not merely coping. He was adapting. The strongest material was still the oldest. Daniel copied the Camera 3 footage onto 2 separate drives this time, one for the Authority, one for the Center Archive. Rachel watched it again before sending the packet out, and the same stillness entered her that had come over her on the first day she saw it. The grainy image had lost none of its force. A small animal had met impossibility in the dark and answered it with method. They sent the appeal with 15 days left before the transfer deadline. After that, waiting became its own kind of labor. Mia checked email too often, then forced herself to stop. Noah grew more silent than usual, spending longer stretches at the outer fence where Scout liked to pause in the afternoons. Daniel stopped mentioning the transfer entirely, as if refusing to give it language might somehow weaken its hold over the future. Scout, of course, remained gloriously unaware of policy. He still inspected his perimeter each morning with patient seriousness, still investigated any change in his environment as though it might contain information worth having. He still drank from the modified trough in the posture he had invented long ago, lowering himself with the same deliberate care. What had once looked desperate now looked natural, as if the body could make a ritual out of rescue. One afternoon, while the waiting stretched and everyone else carried it badly, Scout found a heavy branch that had fallen near the shade line after wind the night before. He approached it from the side, tested it with his upper trunk, failed to get purchase, then shifted his stance and used his forehead to roll one end free. When the branch caught on a rut, he adjusted again, bracing with one knee. Daniel watched and laughed once, low and helpless. Rachel saw the same thing from across the yard and felt the ache of what institutions often missed. A chart could record impairment. A legal standard could define acceptable risk. But neither document could fully contain the meaning of a living creature that kept meeting barriers by inventing its way around them. Scout was not a romantic story to her. He was evidence, complicated, inconvenient, deeply persuasive evidence, but evidence all the same. The response arrived on a Monday afternoon, when the heat had begun to soften, but not yet break. Rachel carried the envelope into her office and closed the door before opening it. She read the first paragraph standing, the second sitting down, and the last one twice. Then she stayed very still, one hand resting on the desk, while something inside her eased by degrees instead of all at once. The Authority had not reversed itself completely. That would have been too clean, too easy, too unlike the world Scout had been living in from the start. But the transfer order was suspended pending a formal expert review. The case, the letter said, raised substantive questions about how standard release assessment criteria should be applied to animals with documented long-term compensatory adaptation. It was not victory. It was an opening. Mia cried when Rachel showed her the letter, then laughed in embarrassment and cried harder. Noah read it once and nodded the way he did when a thing matched something he had believed without needing to announce it. Daniel only asked one question: whether the transfer trucks were still coming on schedule. When Rachel said no, not for now, he sat down in the nearest chair and covered his face with one broad hand for a moment before standing again. Near sunset, Rachel walked out to the paddock with the folded letter in her back pocket. Scout was standing near the fence line, half turned toward the long light, his ears catching gold at the edges. When he noticed her, he did not hurry or startle. He simply shifted his weight and watched her approach with that deep, attentive stillness he had carried since he was small enough to fit inside a rescue truck and fragile enough to be lost by morning. She stopped a few feet away. His trunk moved in its slow, partial arc through the warm air. Not fully restored, never likely to be, but active in the only way that mattered now. His own way. Rachel thought of the words she had once written in his file when he was barely hanging on. Unlikely. She had meant it honestly then. She still honored the honesty of it. But there was another truth standing in front of her now, larger than any early prognosis. They had all assumed, in one form or another, that the injury would define the boundaries of his future. Scout had spent 14 months refusing that version of the story. Not with heroics, not with miracle recovery, but with something quieter and more enduring. Attention, adaptation, persistence, the stubborn decision to keep working with whatever remained. That was what had shocked everyone in the end. Not simply that he survived, but that he kept teaching the world not to close the door too soon. If Scout's story touched your heart, comment 1 below. If you believe no life should be counted out too soon, comment 0. And if you want more powerful, unforgettable animal stories like this one, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next story. There is always another journey, another survival, and another moment that reminds us how much strength can live inside the most fragile life.